Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Bienvenidos, bienvenue. Thank you all for joining us today for today's conversation on the geopolitical implications of the Canadian federal election coming up this Monday. I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists. We have with us Janice Stein, the founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Hi, Janice. We've got Roland, director of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. Hey, Roland. Got Eric Miller, president of the Rideau Potomac Strategy Group, based in Washington, D.C. and Ottawa. And we've also got a new panelist with us today that some of you may not have seen on our webinars before, but Mathew Palmer. He's a consulting senior vice president of corporate issues at Weber Shandwick. And we're going to dive right in. I'm going to actually pass it over to Mathew now to introduce, give us an overview of where we're at with the election and where sort of what's happening with the election in Canada. So what that landscape is. Over to you, Mathew.
Thanks, Marta. It's interesting to try and take this into the 4 minutes or 4.5 minutes that I've been allotted, but I will do my utmost to get there. The easiest way to look at this is I spent 10 years in global affairs, 10 years as a political operative, and 10 years as a senior advisor to a multinational Fortune 20 company. And I can say unequivocally, this is an election like no other for a lot of different reasons. And we can say that all of our norms have been upended, and really we can't rely on kind of traditional modeling or traditional thinking when looking at this election. And it's really easy to get kind of caught up in the personalities, but what I want to do in the kind of 4 minutes that I've got is take a step back and level set to really open up a conversation for the panelists. So first, why is this election different? Well, first we saw kind of the natural fatigue that comes with 10 years of a government in power, right? That just happens. You start to want to have some change. We see that in governments around the world. Most importantly, we then saw Canada lose its special relationship status with the United States. You know, we're now under existential threats. We're seeing untwining of markets. We're seeing a renewed national identity and a questioning of what is our role on the world stage. I would also argue that we still are seeing the market effect of COVID even before Trump took office. So that's evidenced by high cost of living, household debt, shift in the job market. So it really hasn't quite played itself out yet. So really what I see is a change. It's always been a change election, but it's now become who do we trust to lead the country in these unconventional times, backstopped by a renewed sense of nationalism and a renewed sense of Canadian pride, unlike we've seen in, I wouldn't say we even saw it in the referendum, like going back to the referendum in the 90s. So where does that leave us? And I apologize for the background noise as people are moving stuff behind me. We saw a number of different indicators that also fueled media around it. So let's start by saying polls don't vote, people vote. So there's a lot, anytime, and I spent, again, 10 years in politics, polls will tell you what you want to see, and media will pick with the best parts of the polls to report upon. But I think if you deep dive a little bit on the polls, there's some strong indicators that are worth paying attention to. So whether you have this party or that party leading, what's most important to really look at is the Liberals have had a steady momentum since naming a new leader in January. Their poll numbers have continually risen. They're pretty strong. They just saw minor dips, but nothing too, within a point or two. And most importantly, ridings that you would not expect that are now starting to show Liberal signals. So that to me is the more interesting aspect is that, if you're looking, say, rural Alberta, Saskatchewan, we're starting to see even a pulse of Liberal support where we hadn't seen it before. However, the Conservative base is very strong and has not moved. And that's another part of looking at the poll numbers, that if in any other election, these numbers would have indicated a Conservative minority, if not a small majority. So in any other time, the Conservative Party would be in very strong stead. The real tale here is the NDP is just continually free falls, are now sitting in single digits. Arguably, when time, these are times that demand kind of a clear winner with a clear mandate, which we've heard in various places. And the third party is always viewed as a risk, and so even more so. It's not really surprising to me to see the NDP fall off the way that they have. The numbers that we're seeing in right now, we're seeing Liberal support at 42.2, Conservative around 38.5. Those numbers really reflect more, I would say, the NDP and the undecided firming up their decided votes and saying, we want a strong hand at the tiller. We need someone to really represent us on the Canadian world stage. The other indicator that we saw is that there were long lines at the advanced polls. We saw a lot of media around this, long lines at the advanced polls this weekend. Call me a skeptic. However, that's great. Shows that people are engaged and people have made up their minds. But let's not over rotate. It was also, people may be engaged, but people also, it was a long weekend and we had really nice weather in Canada. So these are factors that truly play out. So I still say that this is a very tight election and that we're going to see on Monday, it's still going to be a very tight race with some strong indicators into kind of Carney right now is looking like he will keep the prime ministership, but don't count it out. Now, leading into the panel, and I think I'm still doing okay on time, what is key to this politically is that no matter which party wins, and I think this is going to be key as we start to talk about the geopolitical implications, is there's going to be key portfolios that no matter who wins have to be addressed right away. And this is where the tale of two leaders is going to make a huge difference. Is government is going to need to get a handle on spending. They're going to need to, which arguably is going to look like shrinking the public sector and looking at modernizing procurement. It's going to be getting into and leading the interprovincial trade discussions that right now is happening without them at the table. But I think subject to this, for this webinar, define and manage what our role is with the United States. The relationship has to be repaired. Even if the trade agreement isn't, the relationship itself has to be addressed. And also really looking at, and I don't think we've done this in quite a long time, and Janice, you would know that, is like, what is our role on the world stage? And I think we really have an existential question that we're looking for a leader to answer is, what is our non-US trade? How can we operationalize the existing trade agreements? And also, how do we address defense, sovereignty, and security? And then I guess my final point in my last 60 seconds is it's really come down to a two-person race. I would argue that it's not even a two-party race, that it really seems like it's two personalities at the forefront of this election. And with each candidate, those that like him a lot. And the key takeaways for each of them: Pierre Poilievre, career politician with an attack dog reputation, who has spent the last 3 years really as the anti-Trudeau change agent. Mark Carney, respected banker but political neophyte, that is in a unique position from a political point of view, is that he owes no one any favors. We don't really know what politically where his positions are on a lot of things. He's already shown that he's willing to eschew some of the political norms and moves based on how he named cabinets. There are some very kind of normal political moves that you would have done, like naming some of your competitors into cabinets. He didn't do that. So the table is really wide open. And as we all know, there's a big difference between, and we were talking about this before the call started, there is often a very big difference between what is said in what is said in the platform, the tonality of how it's said in the platform. Is there a mandate letter that goes with that turns it into action, or how is it governed? And I think all of that is up in the table. And really what we're going to see is, again, an election unlike any other, that if anyone thinks they can call it right now, anyone on this call, I would bet a good bottle of wine from anywhere in the world against my Ontario wine, that we still don't know. And I don't think we're going to know for quite some time, even after the election, what direction we're heading in. So that is my domestic policy summary to set up your esteemed panelists. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Matthew. And that the great segue is into Eric. Eric, what are the key economic issues that Canadians feel need to be addressed? And the second part of that is let's launch into the international implications of each party's thing or each candidate's thinking about how they could be addressed.
Yeah, so Ken, thanks very much for the invitation today. Let me start with the second point first, which is about the implications. Why I think this Canadian election is getting arguably more attention than any we've seen in recent times is because it's really a manifestation of the tension going on in international politics. And so you see in Pierre Poilievre someone who is a populist conservative who is skeptical of the role of the state, who wants to shrink the size of government, who speaks at length about individual liberty. And then on the other hand, you see an institutionalist in the form of Mark Carney, someone who is very much of an internationalist, who has relationships with leaders, both in business and politics around the world. And so you have this very stark contrast. And one of the questions that voters are really having to ask themselves is who do I most trust to deal with Donald Trump? And who do I most trust to navigate Canada's way forward in this complicated world? So where are we on the tariff front? I mean, first of all, whenever you talk about tariffs, you need to date and timestamp it because give it a minute and it will change. And so one of the things, though, that I think is an important implication at the moment is if you are not in steel and aluminum, autos, softwood lumber, and a number of other sectors, and you are using the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, or some people call it the USMCA agreement, you are able to export duty-free to the United States. This is something that, besides Canada's partner in Mexico, that nobody else has. Everyone else in the world has been hit with a 10% baseline tariff to export into the United States. And I would argue that the reason why Canada has gotten that exemption is because integration has made Canada extremely important to the United States. So the analogy I would use is that Donald Trump sort of saw Canada as like the small animal in the forest to be picked up and pressured. But then when he picked it up, he realized that Canada was like a porcupine. And when he started to press, he got a lot of pain. And so rather than putting tariffs on Canadian energy and making the price of oil that's refined at the refineries in the Midwest that are calibrated to take Canadian crude, he decided to back off a bit. But by using the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, he is opening a pathway, ironically, that could, if this tendency, which we don't know if it will hold, could lead to Canada having really a preferential access arrangement over the medium term relative to everybody else in the world toward the United States. So ironically, Canada could end up in a better position relative to its competitors. But psychologically, this period has been very hard on Canadians, and Canadians have really taken to heart the idea that Canada needs to diversify its trade. And so, of course, in the auto sector, extraordinarily important in Ontario, you've seen a manifestation of what tariffs mean. And that's why Mr. Carney has promised a $2 billion fund to help the auto sector. You see Mr. Poilievre talk at length about energy. And so he's very focused on how do we get pipelines built? How do we get mines built? Whether they are able to translate statements about making permitting faster into reality is another question. It's often said that leaders campaign in poetry and govern in prose. I mean, sadly, much of the poetry in this election seems like an open mic night on a Thursday night in Toronto, but that being what it may. And so getting energy to market, really important. China has just cut off the market of the United States for liquefied natural gas. With the right infrastructure, Canada could take a big market share. And so Mr. Carney, for his part, has said he wants to make Canada an energy superpower. But in my discussions with people in Western Canada, there's a good amount of skepticism about what that means. And so there is a great deal of focus now on what trade diversification it should be as a concept, but in terms of the actual operationalizing of that concept, there's been precious little thinking. And what either party, whoever becomes prime minister, will find is that they're going to have to think radically differently about what that looks like. And perhaps the structures that are in place now are not going to serve in the future, but it is a new day. And I don't think that this time, even if Canada ends up with a preferential arrangement into Trump's America, that Canadians are going to forget the experience of these past months. And I think that they will look to move deliberately to try to diversify trade. So, bit of a complicated picture, but that's where we are at this moment. Wait till tomorrow, and it could all be different.
Eric, if I just one quick follow-up question, then Marta will bring in Janice and Roland. Is there a difference you think in what the party platforms or what the candidates are saying on how to deal with the United States economically?
Well, it's really a question of trust. It's who do you believe is the right person? So Mr. Carney has said he believes there's limits on dollar for dollar tariffs, which indeed there would be. If you say you're going to have dollar for dollar tariffs on the United States, it means that once you get to a certain point, you're just hurting yourself. Because the point of tariffs is to hurt the other person more than you're hurting yourself. But if you're putting tariffs on everything, it means if I'm an importer of inputs from the United States and I'm trying to build a factory in Ontario to serve the Canadian market, then I'm just going to end up paying more in tariffs. And so Mr. Carney seems to sense that there needs to be some subtlety and nuance. For his part, Mr. Poilievre has focused on laying out, he said, of course, they'll take a hard line, but he's also focused on laying out the red lines. One of them is supply management. He's made very clear that he is not willing to put that on the table. Mr. Carney is not really focused on that. And so what it's going to come down to in the minds of the voters is who do they trust more to deliver? And it's hard to say. I mean, people tell pollsters things, but we've known from past elections recently that you shouldn't necessarily take that to the bank. But I do think it is significant, good weather notwithstanding, that people have voted in very significant numbers in the early polls, because it means that the intensity of interest about this campaign is very significant, and that you're likely going to look at a significantly higher turnout than you've seen in any election in at least 2 decades.
Okay, thanks so much, Eric. I'm going to bring in Roland and Janice into this next question. And as has already been mentioned, it's the first G7 election since the new administration in the US. I want to bring into the conversation the foreign policy implications of this and what's going to go forward. What will be the going forward propositions from either of the two leading candidates, as well as how that relationship to the US might lead into that and what that could look like under either of the two incoming leaders. Janice, could we start with you on that question?
Yeah, let me just thank you all, and thank you to Ken for bringing us all together. I agree that this election is close and is very, very difficult to call. So, Matthew, I'm not going to bet that bottle of wine. I think there are two fundamental questions in this election, and all the rest is noise, frankly. Even the G7 is just noise for everybody at this time. One is the one, Eric, that you just put on the table. Who do we trust to best manage our overwhelmingly important relationship? The Canada-US relationship has been the primary responsibility of every prime minister. It doesn't matter if you have a foreign minister, that is the prime minister's file. There's good reason for that. We are a small country living next to the most dynamic economy in the world. And geography really matters, and it is not going to change no matter who's the president of the United States or the prime minister of Canada. So this is the prime minister's file. So voters are right to ask that question. But there's a second issue, and when Trump is quiet for a couple of weeks, you hear in the conversation of the country that second issue emerging. We need change. Right? And it's it's a quite deeply felt sentiment, and across this party lines, left and right. It just depends. People want to change different things. Let me give you an example of an issue that crosses party lines: productivity. It doesn't matter where you are in this country. You know that we have a productivity problem in this country, that our economy is growing more slowly than our G7 counterparts. Something has to change. And I think with all the static that is coming out of the White House, there's a tendency in our commentary to miss that a little bit. So the real question for me, as I think about the international implications, how do those two vectors align over these next 4 years? How do you put those two together in a coherent package, regardless of who wins? Now, there are big differences between the two candidates on these issues. And Eric, you've talked about them. I don't think I think the platforms are a poor guide to the Liberal Party, because a new leader came in very late to the game. A lot of the work was done before, and frankly, the time span for this, tiny in comparison to a normal process. There was a lot more time for the Conservative Party, and so I think we can take more from that platform. Both of them tell you they're going to be really tough on the United States, really tough. They're going to stand firm. Both of them tell you they're going to diversify our trading relationships. Okay, I'm going to take both of them with a big grain of salt. Okay, Eric? There is an emotional feeling in this country, which is fully justified. There is an upsurge of nationalism that lasts on the 60s, frankly, is the closest to this period. The options to diversify on all the sectors aren't limited. There are opportunities in the energy sector if we actually build the infrastructure that we need. In the auto sector, are we going to export cars to Germany or Japan? It's not going to happen. It's frankly not going to happen. Our agricultural sector is already an exporter beyond North America. It can do more, but it can't do monumentally more. So personally, what I will bet is there will be a tremendous amount of talk about diversification, and we will get from 78% of our exports where we are now to 70%. So in the middle of this huge change election, much will look the same.
Roland, can I invite you to give some thoughts on that and maybe speak to any sort of differences that you might see in between the two leaders?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to, and mindful of the fact that many people joining this call are joining from outside of Canada and don't necessarily have the context. If the question is, what is this election, the party platforms, and what the leaders have said so far, what can that tell us about what Canada is actually likely to do after the election? I would say not a lot. And that's not very surprising for two reasons. One, because there's rarely been a lot of attention to foreign policy beyond the Canada-US relationship in our elections. And even the foreign policy elections in our history have almost all been about trade with the United States. And secondly, because the leaders don't have a great deal of interest in pinning themselves down in advance on these issues when they know that their voters, beyond the question of who can manage Donald Trump, are interested in domestic bread and butter issues like voters, frankly, everywhere. So we don't know a lot about the details about as Janice was suggesting, about how these two leaders will act in office, the details of what they will do at least. Secondly, interestingly, in a lot of what they're saying, there's similarity between the two people. So this has already been hinted at. They both are talking quite tough in terms of retaliating against the United States. This is partly a reflection of the anger in this country that was generated by Donald Trump's, not just his economic threats, but his, his expression of doubt about Canadian sovereignty, his desire to subsume Canada, the United States. And so it became effectively politically impossible for leaders in this country to do anything other than stand up to Trump. It's in contrast to the position that Claudia Sheinbaum, for example, has taken in Mexico, a much more restrained approach to her messaging on Trump. Although I should say that in the end, these two leaders, Mark Carney and Justin Trudeau before him on one hand, and Claudia Sheinbaum on the other, have taken these different strategies towards Trump, but they both ended up in precisely the same place. So both of these leaders are talking tough. They both are talking about wanting to move into negotiations pretty quickly with Trump. They're both talking about significantly increasing Canadian military spending. They're both talking about what Janice said, the importance of diversification of Canada's trade relations. They're both talking about redoubling Canada's resource development, critical minerals, and energy products. They're both talking about building infrastructure to get those products to market. They're both talking about eliminating the internal barriers to trade within Canada. They're both talking about sovereignty in the Arctic. So, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's both vague and very similar, what they've been saying. The difference is, I think on the foreign policy side, it'll be difficult and interesting to see how Pierre Poilievre or Mark Carney will ultimately manage relations with Trump. But and I think it'll come down to the personalities of those two men more than anything else, because I think that they're both inclined to try to get to the negotiating table quickly. Maybe as a little asterisk, Pierre Poilievre may try to appeal to Trump if he becomes prime minister as a fellow conservative. That is a strategy that some leaders have taken in the world, Argentina, Italy, etc. Sometimes it works, oftentimes it doesn't. But aside from that, I think the negotiating strategy and what's on the table will be actually quite similar.
Maybe I could just add one quick
Sure.
comment to what Roland said, because I agree completely with you, Roland. I think it's a really interesting strategic question. My view is we should not be the first to the table. It's actually not in our interest to be number one or number two. I would love to see Japan go ahead. Japan is in deal-making mode, not for the first time. It's been in deal-making mode. After that are the South Koreans right behind the Japanese. I think Canada and Mexico will do much better if we have a little bit of strategic patience here and we let at least two or three go before us.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I would say that it's still useful to have a table because it's a way of channeling Trump if he starts if he starts paying attention again to Canada and Mexico and having that discussion move to the table. But I agree that time in a sense is Canada's friend and Mexico's friend here for two reasons. One, because Trump is going to be utterly consumed by the 90 deals in 90 days that he said he was going to negotiate. And there's going to be some tough issues, even in just a negotiation with Japan. But he says he's going to have one with the EU too. And he's already backtracking on China. So he will be consumed by other things. And secondly, every week that goes by is another week closer to the inflationary impact of the tariffs that he's already established and Chinese retaliatory tariffs, which shifts the strategic environment probably a little bit in Canada's favor. Let me just conclude with one last thought, which is that I talked about the similarities and differences. I think that it comes down to, this is another way of saying what Eric and Janice both said. It comes down to the details of how they implement these objectives. And, these are huge things that they're undertaking to do, dealing with breaking through barriers in trade within Canada, which for various reasons have been there for a long time, but there are vested interests behind those barriers, about breaking through barriers in resource development and the movement of resources that engage jurisdictional, Indigenous rights and environmental issues. That's going to be hard. The kinds of investments that at least Mark Carney is talking about making in the domestic economy. Pierre Poilievre has a little bit more of a free market approach to the idea of how to strengthen the Canadian economy. The diversification strategy, I mean, this is going to be a lot of work, and each one of those things is going to be tough. So we're probably going to muddle through like we always do. That's not a criticism. It's just a fact.
Roland, you're giving away Canadian secrets to the rest of the world about us muddling through. But let me, and Eric, I want to bring you into this as well. But let's work off of that. One of the received pieces of wisdom in Canada and a pillar of foreign policy has been multilateralism and an international rules-based order, right? Now that includes not just for security and NATO and the like, it's economic, trade pacts, trade treaties, political institutions, the United Nations and its agencies and the like. But how does that survive in what people are thinking? Well, how does Canada and how will the two candidates view the potential destruction, or certainly the relegation of that to what appears to be more of a transactional approach where might makes right?
So let me start us off here, and I'm going to be as provocative as I can.
Please.
How the two candidates feel about a funeral? Okay, it's interesting only up to a point. Most of what he talked about there Ken died, but some of us have had a lot of trouble burying it. It's gone. I don't know about you, Roland, but I've been talking about this for close to a decade now. And it's not the rules-based order that's gone. It's the liberal rules-based order that's gone. There are always rules. Trade agreements are rules, all right? Multilateralism is, frankly, we do it, but it's not an objective in and of itself. We use our relationships with others to achieve things that are important to us. And part of what people react against in the country is sloganeering about these kinds of issues for something that is dead, in the coffin, buried, but people won't come to grips with it. So I frankly think that's the wrong question for the next 5 years for either of the prime ministers. To me, what are the questions? How does Canada improve its economic performance in ways that benefit its citizens? How does it improve its competitiveness? How does it, in fact, contribute to its defense spending in ways that its allies will appreciate and really maximize the value and build its defense industrial base in collaboration with partners that it chooses? Those are the two biggest spend questions that any prime minister of this country has to deal with. Everything else, given the sense of urgency, which I'm so grateful for, because that's one of the things we've lacked, anything else, there's a huge gap between those first two issues and everything else that's on the agenda. And we have limited fiscal resources. Let's add that one. We're at the fiscal ceiling. And that's really important. And that's a problem for Donald Trump, by the way, too, which we don't talk enough about. But we are at the fiscal ceiling here. We don't have a lot of room for maneuver. And these two men are promising to do really big things because of the change in the United States. That's it for this next prime minister. Everything else shuffled off.
Okay, that is provocative. Roland, and then I'll come to Eric. Thank you, Janice.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I always love listening to Janice. She structures her thoughts in paragraphs, and I appreciate that. I agree, multilateralism isn't an end in itself. It's a means of achieving ends. And I also agree about the issues, and particularly the opportunity to use this massive defense investment as a way of strengthening partnerships with with a range of countries and kickstarting elements of the Canadian economy too. I mean, we could be both deepening a partnership, an economic and security partnership with our European partners, not just Europe, and other partners, while at the same time building technology partnerships, which is really what we're talking about when we're talking about these massive defense investments. Where I would disagree is I see the patient of multilateralism on the table, and that patient isn't dead. It's suffered, some very significant blows. In fact, I'm not even sure if the metaphor is very good, because it's not a single body, and that's the point I would want to make, is that when we talk about multilateralism, it's an absolutely complex array of different arrangements, some of them formal, some of them informal. And there's some that may continue chugging along, and that's important. There's some that have no hope, and there's some that potentially could be adapted, or even if the United States withdraws, whether it's financially or diplomatically, there may be opportunities for other countries to step forward to sustain some of them. I'm thinking about specific agencies within the UN, and this is a good way of illustrating the difference between the dead body metaphor and the let's look at specifics. Because the UN as an institution, obviously suffering now very serious challenges and not looking great going forward, both in terms of its likely budget and its prospect of being able to deliver the very core security functions of the UN, but it's also a collection of very functional and in many cases very useful international agencies that we have an interest in seeing, many of which, not all, many of which we have an interest in seeing sustained. And I think that there's an opportunity for Canada to do that. And it's not for the sake of multilateralism itself. It is so that we can work with partners to achieve things that we collectively think are important to try to accomplish. And that's going to be a complicated story going forward. In terms of the difference between these two leaders, I think Eric said that Carney is an institutionalist. I agree. I mean, he's like the classic internationalist. It comes through in the way that he's talking. It comes through in the party platform. And it comes through in him talking about redoubling Canada's diplomatic representation, not cutting aid, being part of problem solving. Whereas Pierre Poilievre is a skeptic in this area. He has said that he would cut foreign aid, which he's described as corrupt and wasteful, I think are the terms. And we don't know, how he might view these international institutions, but he's been in governments that have had a more skeptical view, let's put it that way. But bottom line is both of these people are going to be refocused on Canadian interests, and Canadian interests are going to be driving Canadian foreign policy much more going forward than they have in the past.
Let's put one other issue on the table, because which is the size of government in Canada, which this is not something Canadians have. It hasn't captured the public attention really before this, but it is on the agenda now, partly as a result of the productivity debate, where Canadians are being told that all levels of government today in Canada account for 40% of our GDP. Well, that's a large part of our productivity. And out of that is coming, I think, an interesting agenda for how do you, in fact, now I don't use the word cut, but how do you reform government, especially at the federal level, so it becomes more effective across a whole variety of issues? That one is really on the table, and there's huge differences in the way these two prime ministers think about it. I think we're very fortunate in this country that Doge came first. There's an enormous opportunity to learn what not to do, but neither has really articulated a coherent strategy of how to do it. And both of them have to do it no matter what happens. It's really hard to do.
So, Ken, my sense first on multilateralism, one of the things that the world is going to find out is how much money the U.S. has paid into running all of these institutions. And when you look at the fact of the World Health Organization, top funder, government of the United States, second top funder, Gates Foundation, bigger than China, bigger than the UK, bigger than anyone. And I hate to say it, but the cavalry's not coming, because when you look at Europe, Europe's got to spend a fortune on defense. When you look at China, there has been a willingness to use the benefits of multilateralism, but not a willingness to step up and pay the bill and to sustain the institutions. Canada, one thing it needs to get away from in its foreign policy is to join clubs for the sake of joining. There has to be a purpose, and that's something that needs to be considered very, very strongly. So Canada said it wanted to join the AUKUS agreement with the UK and Australia. And the question was, why? What are you going to bring to the table spending 1.29% or now 1.37% of GDP on defense? And so the investments in defense are table stakes to being able to be part of bigger conversations. But there's going to be a great deal of challenge. As Janice has said, there is a fiscal ceiling here, and this is going to be very difficult. I cannot describe how badly administered the DOGE process has been. So among the people who've gotten fired are people who are considered provisional, and provisional people are people who've been promoted from a director to a senior director, and they're provisional in that senior director role and have therefore been easier to get rid of. The loss of USAID and so on is a catastrophe. So the world is going to get less multilateralism simply because nobody is willing to step up and pay for it. And so that's the reality that the world is looking at. But then Canada has to ask, well, if we're not putting money into institutions, then where is money going? And how are you projecting your influence? What are you doing that's important? And of course, here we're talking about Latin America, and there needs to be a whole thinking about what is the Canada-Latin America relationship that's not intermediated through the United States, and to think about what's the relationship with Mexico. You've heard premiers say, we would like Mexico to not be in the trade agreement that Canada has with the new administration. Whether that will happen or not, who knows? But there needs to be a serious discussion there, because time and again, Canada and Mexico have been able to collaborate on issues vis-a-vis the United States. But the world is changing, and so whether the country is ready for it or not, it is not going to be able to continue to live like it's 1955.
Yeah,
because that world is gone, over, finished.
I could, if I could jump in here, and by the way, I apologize if you hear something moaning in the back, it's because we are cat sitting and the cat is trying to get in here. So I apologize. It's not somebody crying. It is a feline.
My dog likes speaking at these events too, Roland.
Right.
So it's okay.
Roland, I think with
Roland, we'll take your word for it anyway.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But
Okay.
if I can just jump in, like I agree with the essence of what Eric just said. But again, I think that it actually, when we're talking about Latin America, illustrates why the dead, not dead, or, surviving multilateralism or not, is actually not that helpful. I agree with you about being selective, but and the world changing. But look, in the case of Latin America, you have the Organization of American States. And if Canada wants to maintain its engagement in Latin America, if it wants to be deepening trade relations, if it wants to try and breathe life into the many free trade agreements we have in Latin America, then presumably Canada wants to continue functioning within the Organization of American States at a moment when the American voluntary contributions have been suspended. So you see, there are interesting spaces for Canada to be operating in that don't require us to make a binary decision about whether multilateralism is on or off.
Just to come in behind you there, Roland, that's a very different argument you're making now, because that is That's the means question. How do we achieve our objectives most effectively, right? And so if there's an institution, we want to deepen our relationships in Latin America, and we have to explain why we want to do that, what interests are being served, what goals we want to achieve. Then you look around and you search for the most effective means. That's very different from the period that we've had really for the last 70 years in which multilateralism had a big capital M, as you know, and it was often used as a goal. And that's what I think Eric is rightly putting his finger on. A lot of these institutions, it's really stunning when you look at how many institutions are crippled. Multilateral institutions are crippled by the chaos in USAID and the drastic cutting of that budget. It is unbelievable how much of the basic infrastructure was funded by the United States, and there's no replacement for that. There's no replacement. So I think it's critically important for Canadians, both our public and our leaders, to understand we're in a different world now. We don't know where the United States is going. If Eric won't bet a bottle of wine on the election, I think it would be suicidal, Eric, to bet a bottle of champagne on where the United States will be 5 years from now. Almost anything is possible. And so we're in a period where the international order that we knew is gone. Something else is being put in place, but it's a period of really deep uncertainty. And that requires a nimbleness and a flexibility on the part of our leaders and the public. This is an election. Everybody needs to win. Everybody says what they know they need to say, not to rock the boat. But the world starts on April 29th.
And I agree, Roland. I think there are really interesting opportunities, but there's going to have to be hard decisions about what you want to prioritize and how you want to prioritize it. And so whether it's the Inter-American Development Bank, the OAS, bilateral processes, it's going to be something that's important because the whole infrastructure is not going to survive. And, you're going to have to, if you're Canada, you're saying, all right, spending more on defense, figuring out my economy issues, trying to get energy to Tidewater, doing all of these things. Well, how do these domestic investments link up with what I want to do with Latin America, Asia, Europe, wherever? And so it's, we're kind of, to use the Dean Atkinson metaphor, we're present at the creation here because, the world is being born anew, and Canada, by being the first election of the second Trump era, is really helping to define the thinking about this. And Canada has, over the years, with the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement and so on, been a path breaker on this, and it can again if it's willing to let the past go and build for the future.
Yeah, we're present at the destruction. I mean, the Antonio Gramsci line, which I'm paraphrasing, that the old is dead and the new is not yet born.
Right.
Yeah.
That's where we are.
Yeah. Roland, and Eric, let's pick up on one issue that Roland started us off on, but we didn't go back to, which is how we think about technology across all these dimensions that we talked about today, right? In terms of increasing our productivity, which there's no Canadian now that doesn't get it. I don't think that we have to do better. Increasing the effectiveness of government, how it delivers services to citizens. I mean, you're seeing this is, in fact, an agenda in almost every country. You see South Korea doing really interesting things here. Qatar, I was just reading this morning, is now leading on a very interesting experiment. We have to do better here. Defense spending. How do we connect our investments in technology, which is all dual use or mainly dual use? How do we get much better at doing that? The resource sector, which is very important for both. It's not only simultaneous permitting, which, by the way, is not rocket science. You can do 3 things at one time. I don't cut people a lot of slack on that. But more important, the resource sector in the next 10 years is going to be all about technology. And the capacity to use advanced technology in very effective ways, which are going to transform that sector. that also cuts across party lines. It's a national challenge, and we have a lot of strength. That's, I think, a huge issue for the next leader, for the next prime minister of this country, to get that right, because we're not good enough.
Yeah, Janice, I'm involved in a process of trying to think through an encryption regime and what should encryption policy look like. And the number one piece that comes out from that is you have to get that right, because that's the facilitator of tech sector growth going forward.
Absolutely.
Because everything is built on encryption. Our ability to have a private meeting and not have somebody who's not invited to come in is built on encryption. And so, there's these foundational pieces, but I think it will be important for the prime minister, whoever they are, to also connect up. We're doing this encryption reform process because it's linked to growing the tech sector globally. So connecting up the pieces will be important to maintaining support for these important domestic reforms.
I'd like to thank you for all of this. I want to pull this back. We just have a few remaining minutes. Another pillar of Canadian foreign policy, regardless of party over the last number of years, has been human rights and democracy promotion. And I hesitate to ask this question based on everything that was said before, but if you are a country, a Latin American country, so it's in this case, or another one, but let's say specific Latin America, what might you expect from the Canadian government on that file? No matter who's the prime minister. Who wants to take a shot at that?
I mean, I can jump in. It's interesting. I was talking about the similarities between the two leaders, and I noticed that in the Liberal platform, they had the phrase democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And that was a phrase that a previous Conservative prime minister used to describe what are the key elements of the values component of Canadian foreign policy. So again, there are these similarities across the line, but I think that what you're already seeing is an awareness that there's a crisis in this country that we're facing, and it's not just the kind of bizarre show of the U.S. president, threatening to absorb Canada. It's the changing context where we can no longer rely on the United States in a way that we could before. To not use its disproportionate power to inflict harm on Canada or to turn that around. We can't rely on the idea of having a ready access to the U.S. market going forward. And that is a very clarifying set of circumstances. And under those circumstances, then you find that the conversation very much shifts to what do we absolutely urgently need to do in order to safeguard the well-being of Canadians, their economic security, even their physical security. So we have operated in a period, Canada, of a very long period, a wonderful period of a relatively benign environment where we've been able not to really have to attend to some of these very core interest questions because they were being handled by the fact that we had easy access to the world's richest economy, and we were kind of guaranteed security here in our position in North America. So when all those things start being called into question, then attention starts focusing on those other issues, and it is a limited, a scarce resource, political attention. And I think that you're going to see, because by implication, if the priority is going to be more on making sure that we're advancing Canadian interests when the security and economic realm, then that means there'll be less attention for those other issues. But I don't think any Canadian government walks away from those issues. And so we face, I guess, as a country, a kind of dual imperative. On one hand, we actually, for our own well-being, we need to pull ourselves closer together with countries that share our values, those countries that are let's call them rule of law democracies, where the United States membership in that group is now being questioned, rule of law democracy. At the same time, we have an urgent need to be working with other partners on other issues. If we want to expand trade in the Indo-Pacific region or even in Latin America, then we can't be purer than the driven snow. And we have to be able to recognize that we can actually continue trading with China without agreeing to any of their proposals that we join up in a diplomatic campaign with them that's effectively an anti-American coalition. So it's this dual need to both pull together with countries that share our values, but also to be as flexible, and I think somebody said supple enough, in order to be able to operate with virtually anyone.
I completely agree with Roland, and I would only add one more comment, which we don't talk about openly in Canada, but I think we should. There's a crisis of democracy in a democratic world.
Mm-hmm.
We have repair work to do at home. Virtually every democratic country, every developed democratic country is facing some form of crisis of democracy. I think you engage in democracy promotion when you're confident and you feel that you have something to share. I think actually it's a moment for humility amongst ourselves and a willingness to look at what we need to do ourselves, because the democratic rule of law institutions and rule of law is fundamental to each of us at home. They're not as strong, they're not as supple, they're not as resilient as we thought. So I think democracy promotion is put aside until we do the repair work at home that we need to do.
Eric, I want to thank you, Janice. Eric, I want to call you'll have, as our newest board member, Eric, you have the last shot at this, but just to put a little fine spin on it, if you're sitting in Latin America and you're looking in certain cases at creeping authoritarianism and beyond, and you know many of the countries we're talking about, how do you interpret what you've just heard and a coherent message to our friends in Latin America that might think that they can look to Canada to be a very useful ally in that fight for democracy and human rights?
So one of the challenges that exists is I don't think Canada, like other countries, really knows what it means to successfully promote a democratic agenda. So it's not like there's a handbook you can pull off the shelf and say, here's what really should be the case. And some have raised concerns about human rights in El Salvador, but President Bukele has been elected. And so is that democratic? I think by any standard, people would say it is. He's the most popular leader in Latin America. And so I think these are concepts which are very important, but I agree with Janice that it is a moment for humility. And perhaps if there is to be a reimagining of what the democracy and human rights agenda looks like, there will have to be a dialogue about where people are coming from, because there has clearly been a retreat from a widespread belief in democracy in Latin America and in other regions in the world. And part of that has had to do with insecurity. If you ask many people in El Salvador, they will tell you that their lives are better off because they can leave their neighborhoods to go shopping without risk of being kidnapped, killed, and worse. And so it's the whole question about weak governance, about the challenges of organized crime challenging state authority. And I don't think that there is necessarily an easy answer to this. So if you came to me and said, what would be a really effective agenda for promoting democracy and human rights in country X, I don't think you can really get to that point without having a serious dialogue with country X and also being honest with yourself about what you can truly deliver. We've seen lots of training sessions from the RCMP with police forces and election monitoring, but ultimately democracy lives or dies based on the will of their citizenry. And if there is skepticism in the region about democracy as a certain form, or if the democracy is linked up with perhaps a more, to put it diplomatically, a more aggressive executive assertion of power, and that president ends up being very popular, I think we have to take a step back and ask, what is that telling us? And what, in the context of many of Canada's priorities, should really be done? And would Canada's interests be better served in the region figuring out how to trade more rather than doing sessions on democracy and human rights? And that's not a statement that it would be, but I do think that the environment we're in is much, much, much more complicated and much more muddled than we were before. Because when you look at the number of countries who were democracies or becoming democracies 20 years ago versus today, there's clearly been some backsliding from, indices from Freedom House and others. So it's time for us to have a dialogue with ourselves and a dialogue with others to figure out how you effectively approach this.
Thank you so much, Eric. Roland and Janice, did either of you want to say a last final word before we close off? No. Okay, well then I'm just going to thank our panelists. Thank you, Roland. Thank you, Janice. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Mathew, for joining us at the beginning. We will have the video up in short order and welcome you to join us again for our continuing webinars on this and other issues affecting the Western Hemisphere. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.